No sé por qué, pero gracias. Gracias, Rodo. Esta es mi octava LabiConf. Saben que ya han hecho 8, ¿no? 8 LabiConfs. So I'm very proud to be here, to be friends with this amazing team, this group. And we're going to talk about regulation, but please don't shoot the messenger. We're just trying to help. We're trying to build a bridge between that future that you all are dreaming and Andrea so eloquently paints in our minds, and the reality of today. And there's always a difference between desire and reality. So we are here to show you reality. This discussion is about what exists today, what the obligations are today, and hopefully it will be educational, enriching to all of you. I'm very proud to be surrounded by an amazing panel. We have Albert Isola on my immediate left, who's a minister for the government of Gibraltar. And we have Paulo Coirolo from Uruguay, who's also an ambassador, in a way, kind of from Liechtenstein, a small nation, I would say, in the border between Switzerland and Austria. And Joey Garcia, despite that last name, he's also Gibraltar-born citizen, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And has a very English accent too. And Jacob Farber, who is a very well-known lawyer. I've known Jacob for 5 years already. He's been around a lot. Perkins Coie, R3, private practice right now. Super smart people. And we wanted to just talk about the reality today. And I usually introduce the topic of regulation by saying that there are, just to set a framework for all of us to understand, when we talk about regulation or regulators, we have to make distinctions. Not all regulators are equal, not all regulation is the same. So I usually talk about 3 functions within regulation and 3 types of regulators. This is just to set a quick framework, and then I'm going to let my panelists talk about whatever they want to talk. First thing is that there's regulators that promote growth and the economy. They want to attract tax revenue. They want to create jobs, development, right? I call those regulators, those policies or regulations, stimulative. They're meant to stimulate the economy. So when we say F regulation, kill regulation, we don't want any regulation. There are some policies that could be very beneficial for our businesses. So we should be, or regulations that should attract us and should be enable our businesses to grow and to be launched. So we have to understand that there are stimulative regulations that are good for our businesses in different jurisdictions. The second thing is prudential regulation. Regulation intended to control abuse or negligence or malpractice, right? So we have all these protective, some say paternalistic, right, controls issued by the government to make sure that the service providers are safe and sound, that they are very responsible, that they don't overhype or overpromote benefits that don't exist, etc., and obviously that losses and systemic risks are minimized or prevented. And then we have financial crime, the police. If you commit crimes, you're subject to a completely different area of regulation or sphere of regulation, which is financial crime, mostly enforcement. You cannot regulate with a law enforcement. You can negotiate a little bit with deferred prosecution agreements, but once you're under prosecution, you're under prosecution. So we have to differentiate that. And then there's different functions within regulation. Policy making, the strategy, how to deal with problems, oversight or supervision, and enforcement. When something goes wrong, what happens? So, and we have the problem that these regulations are country-specific. They're not designed, were never designed to be global because until now there was no global technology that was reaching anywhere in the world. So we have jurisdiction-specific and activity-based, product-based regulation. A huge problem today. We have regulation for insurance, for securities, for money transmission, in Gibraltar, in Europe, in South America, in Australia, in the United States, at the state level and at the federal level. So we have different layers of regulation, different products addressed, different regimes, all floating around as networks float around invisibly, right? So this is the situation in the world today, and now we have blockchain. And blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, in my opinion, are completely incompatible with the regulatory frameworks that exist today. With that introduction, I'm just going to ask my panelists here, any opening thoughts about probably what your jurisdiction is offering. We have 3 representatives from Europe, and maybe Jacob and I could talk to the United States. But we have fairly good coverage of what happens in the world and how regulation works around the world. So any thoughts about Gibraltar?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think from my perspective, you've mentioned 3 strands of what you call regulation in terms of the first, the second being the prudential, and the third being the financial crime. And the first element of regulation you referred to for me, which you rightly called policy, is very much something that comes from a government and from a legislator. We set the policy that the regulator then has to implement through his interpretation of our legislation. And when you talk about policy, certainly in our respect, the desire of our government in welcoming innovation in blockchain and the DLT framework that we set up on the 1st of January this year was to do it, but do it properly. And so the philosophical approach is very simple, and it's one that we used in gaming 25 years ago, which is we only want quality firms to come to Gibraltar. We want them to have their mind and management in Gibraltar. So you have to be there, otherwise we cannot do the second limb, which is regulation. And the third aspect is they have to be regulated. And that simple philosophy, when we did that 25 years ago with gaming, today we are probably the premier gaming jurisdiction in the world in online betting. And why is that? It's because we introduced a regulatory framework which enabled good companies, quality companies, to work safely, knowing that they were complying with the law, giving them that legal and regulatory certainty that is now being talked about in the blockchain space in exactly the same way. And in those 25 years, we haven't had one single company that's failed. And if you look at many other jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom, every year they have gaming companies that fail. So regulation is not the panacea that you might think in terms of bringing trust and stopping failures. It doesn't. But it certainly helps to prevent them. And we are very concerned, and always have been, about our reputation. And so when you talk about policy, which I agree entirely with, our policy is simple. We want to attract firms that want to do blockchain. We want to attract firms that are interested in doing it in the right way and who care about their reputation as much as we care about ours. And so the regulatory framework for us delivers that, which is a legislative framework of core principles which deal with corporate governance, which deal with anti-money laundering and crime, which deals with capital security, markets. How are you going to work in all these areas? And if you can meet those criteria, you can then come into the regulatory framework that we've set up in Gibraltar. And I think it used to be a contradiction, innovation and regulation, because they seem to be at crossroads with each other. But the truth is, it's not the case. You've got sandboxes springing up in different regulatory frameworks in many different countries. And in our regulator, 2.5 years ago, we set up, and this is separate from government obviously, an innovation team, because actually the regulator welcomes innovation if it's done properly. And innovation is not new, let's be clear. We've had innovations for hundreds and thousands of years. It's just the innovative step today appears to be blockchain. But blockchain is not the be-all and end-all. It only works in certain specified areas. And so when you're able to pan out where you believe this can have most impact, it's not difficult to bring it within a flexible and discretionary regulatory framework, which is what we have given our regulator. I have to say, to close, before I pass on, it's the first time that our government has given any regulator in Gibraltar the discretionary powers that we have in respect of blockchain. And the reason is very simple. You cannot put blockchain into a box. If I look at the growth and the speed of change from the 1st of January this year, when the law was introduced, to today, 12 months later, if we wouldn't have given the regulator that discretionary power to regulate these firms, it would have been very hard pressed to do so. So I think there has to be, in this whole space, flexibility, discretion in the hands of regulators to enable them to keep up with the very changing and fast speed of this sector. Thank you.
It looks like Jacob wanted to say something, or...
I mean, I'm alwaay happy to say something, but if we want to just keep going down the line, that's great. I can hold my thought.
Okay, Pablo then.
I'm Pablo Coirolo, and I'm coming representing Liechtenstein. And one of the things that you said, Albert, which I totally agree, is reputation. And this is something that every jurisdiction is looking at. In Liechtenstein, it has been the key element for the Prime Minister when he started, sponsoring and really wanting to enter into the blockchain space. And the regulator is there to protect the reputation of the country. So everybody who enters into this jurisdiction has to understand that you have to have a serious projects, and that the regulators in these days are starting to be different types of regulators. They're being more smart. They will go into your Telegram groups. They will understand what you are saying. And one thing is what the application that you do. The other thing is what you're saying in public. And I think that this change is very positive. And if you go to a jurisdiction where you have an alignment between the government, the regulatory framework, and the financial system, then those are what we call crypto-friendly jurisdictions. And that's what we try to do in Liechtenstein. We work very closely with the banking sector, so you can actually have a bank account to do your project. We launched this summer the Blockchain Act, the Blockchain Act is a fully regulated framework to be able to operate all blockchain technologies and DTL technologies. And we are technology agnostic, because just as you were saying, this evolves at a rate of speed which in the next 2 months, something can appear that will totally revolutionize everything that we're doing. I always like to say that we are living like in dog years in blockchain. 1 year is equivalent to 7 years. So I think in terms of the jurisdiction, and what we are doing as a jurisdiction is trying to set very clear rules of how to work. Very transparent. You can read online our Blockchain Act, understand how it's going to be implemented, and how we are going to be regulating. It's a different approach to other jurisdictions who already have a framework and have applied that framework. We started from zero, and actually it took us 2 years of internal discussions and different teams to be able to come up with this legislation. So,
I mean, I won't give a sort of jurisdictional overview of Gibraltar, but from a global perspective, or certainly from a European perspective, I think what's really interesting is, I suppose if we go back in time a little bit, 2013, I think it was FinCEN that started to apply basic AML KYC rules to this industry. And they thought that, everyone thought that that would be enough. Maybe 2015, the FATF put out their recommendations as to what regulations should start to look like. Again, no one really adopted that. So this is a sort of, it's an emerging space of regulation alongside the emerging space of the actual use of the technology as well. And what I think is, if we look at, you can use jurisdictions like, I don't know, Luxembourg, where they will apply certain payment services rules to an exchange. In the US, you may fall under money transmission rules or other specialist regimes like the bit license, etc. In the UK, you may fall outside of the scope of any of those. In Germany, you may trigger banking requirements because BTC is regarded as a unit of account. So everyone is interpreting this stuff differently, and they're all trying to fix it within existing regimes. And I suppose that's the same in South America as well. The key is building something new, building something that is actually purpose-built, proportionate to this actual technology. And all of the things that the 3 headlines that you've mentioned are absolutely critical, but ultimately it's about consumer-facing, consumer protection. I mean, that is the driver of all of this stuff. No one's trying to regulate the technology. We're trying to regulate the counterparts that are using the technology for certain services.
Neil Ferguson, a scholar, Harvard and now Stanford scholar, said that he wrote a book about the rule, about how the rule of law has become the rule of lawyers. He calls the book The Great Degeneration. It's kind of, it sounds like scathing against lawyers, but it's not. It's really a really well thought out and deep analysis of how we have sunk ourselves in the letter of the law, tomes and reams of regulations, and the world is going in a completely different direction with completely global technology, completely cross-border technology.
Yeah.
So, and how, is regulation incompatible with blockchain, or how do we solve that problem?
I mean, I think it's, again, it has to be proportionate, but to use the clearest example to answer that question, on one extreme, you've got the classic, whatever, code is law arguments, right? And on the other extreme, you have the argument of regulation has to apply to everything. If you look at the legal or academic analysis that's been done on smart contracts around things like ICOs, etc., look at the compatibility of that smart contract with what was actually written in a white paper or a prospectus or offering document. I mean, they're so completely incompatible sometimes. Right. No one actually reads the smart contract. So to say that the regulation of law is not necessary, I mean, maybe the law is only requiring something like an external independent audit of that smart contract.
So my point is that even if you achieve the policy objective of consumer protection, like the avoidance of loss, complete avoidance of loss, for example, with a multi-signature solution,
yeah,
right, or a sharded key, or something that is ultra secure, more secure than exogenous regulation, which is the obligation to, have a good database. That's regulation. Right. So do you know if the database is well kept, is well designed and well managed? No one knows that, and we found out after the fact that they were not, right? So, but if you have algorithmic regulation or enforced in the code through a smart contract, that's potentially much more secure for consumer protection than the obligation to follow these 17 steps. So my point is, the letter of the law still needs to be complied with, in spite of having, met the policy objective through the technology. Any thoughts about that or anything?
Yeah, we saw this in the U.S. in 2012 and 2013, because you're right, it was really FinCEN. FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and it's the agency of the U.S. Department of Treasury that in 2013 issued an order that basically said that the conventional regulation that applies to money transmission businesses in the U.S., they're going to apply it to virtual currency businesses. If it was money transmission, if it was involving real money, it's going to be money transmission if it involved crypto, virtual currency, Bitcoin. And that was the first application of regulation to crypto on a large scale. And there had been quite a debate leading up to that, where the community advocates argued basically what a lot of us are saying on this panel, that this is different. Give it time to be different. We don't need to apply the conventional structures. And the conventional structures got applied. And one, you just said, I think crypto should be regulated completely differently. The conventional structures don't apply. They don't. But I think, at least for this generation of the technology, that train has left the station, because the regulators are applying their traditional structures. And even the jurisdictions that are adopting new pro-crypto, pro-blockchain frameworks are doing it within the confines of sort of traditional financial regulation. They're just writing rules in those areas specific to blockchain. Nobody is saying, hey, this is blockchain, it's decentralized, let's take radically different approaches, because one, regulators regulate. Two, the industry hasn't done itself any favors. I mean, you can look at the ICO boom in 2017 and 2018 as the industry kind of eating itself, because with opportunity came massive scams. There were a lot in 2013, 2014, you had Silk Road, you had Mt. Gox, you had episodes that made the regulators sort of need to regulate. And then third, I think it's still very, very early on for the development of radically new structures. People are just getting their heads around the technology. The problem is once you get a regulator to understand some aspect of blockchain, that takes 6 months. Meanwhile, there's been 6 months of development since you started talking to them, and in real years, that's like, 10 years, and then they're always having to catch up, and regulators are not a fast-moving animal. No offense to the panelists. It's one of the challenges of regulating in this space is that you're having to keep up with the technology where the rate of change is just stunning. It's not an easy task, and so we're stuck right now, I think. The real world
But I think I think you have to look also at the other aspect of that. The 2008 crisis, which was the greatest financial crisis, is clear that regulation did not meet and didn't catch up with what was going in the financial system. So what I always say is we need to be measured by at least the same standard as the financial system. I was telling you in the back the story of Danske Bank. Danske Bank laundered $238 billion, okay, in a 7-year period. And the corresponding banks was Bank of America and JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. But, where were the regulators there? So what I'm saying, and again, it's not to be controversial, what I'm saying is, in crypto, I understand that we have to have regulation, and I agree that we need to have regulation and standards. But what can't happen is that we are set to a higher standard than the financial system.
I couldn't agree with you more. And just to be clear, I'm not arguing that we should or shouldn't have regulation. I think it's complicated, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to figure out a wiser way of approaching these technologies that still protects people where you absolutely need to. All I'm saying is it's the reality. And look, I'm from the U.S., and there's no question that the regulators are regulating, and the SEC chairman has said, basically word for word, there's nothing new here. There's nothing new under the sun. These ICOs, these token sales, they're just security offerings. We've seen them before. We'll see them again. There's always a new close on an old actor, and they're taking the approach. Same old thing. In fact, our framework, the SEC would tell you, very nicely handles this. Now, I don't necessarily buy that view, but that's how the regulators in a lot of jurisdictions are, fortunately or unfortunately, looking at it, and that's what we have to deal with. I wasn't advocating that approach.
I can just, just one it's very relevant. I think, the financial regimes that exist in the world, those principles are going to exist, but how they're applied to this world is what the argument is about. So to use a very simple example, something like suitability and appropriateness, right? So if I sell you a derivative product, I need to check certain things before I'm allowed to do that, very simply. If I sell you a crypto-related product, arguably you're not triggering the definition of whatever it is, transferable security or financial instrument. So what does that mean? That no suitability testing applies, or does it mean that we need to apply suitability in a different way? I've met 16-year-old guys that are much more suitable to making a decision about whether to buy a particular asset than a guy who happens to have $1 million in the bank.
The accredited investor test could be one, right?
Accredited investors, the US, we have in the Europe, the professional investor test, a minimum of whatever it is, 150,000 euros would trigger the requirement for that. Arguably, that's just not right. And then there are other regimes. There are crowdfunding regimes that exist in lots of different parts of the world where the tests there are very different. So they're not the classic suitability test. Your contribution might be restricted to 10% of your net asset savings. So a loss that is, can be managed. So should the suitability regimes be amended to deal with this new crypto universe? I think that's where the arguments have to be.
Good discussion we cannot have now is how to adapt the system and to achieve those goals. Albert, do you want to say something?
Look, I think there's no question regulation is coming and necessary because, you talk about everyone knows what they have to do and the rules are quite clear even in the traditional financial markets, but you don't regulate for the good guys, you actually regulate ultimately for the bad guys. And if you look at the example that Jacob was talking about in 2017-18 with the ICOs, if you wanted evidence of scammers, you've got it there. 82% of the money appears to have been lost in all the ICOs that happened during 2017, a huge amount of money. Now, are we going to sit back and do nothing? And that's where the difference lies. The difference lies in the approach that governments take to regulate in the space. And inevitably, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out why, the smaller territories are better at devising schemes which work for the private sector and work for the public sector. And so it doesn't surprise me Liechtenstein is doing well, as are we. We've got 40 new firms, quality firms, wanting to be regulated. But why? Because the regulatory framework that we've devised, and I'm sure you have also, took us 4 years to develop. We set up a group which was private sector, public sector, and the regulator sitting around a table for 4 years saying, how do we do this in a way which encourages firms to come safely? And ultimately, that's what you want regulation for. So our experience has been, be pragmatic, be practical, come up with a regulatory framework that is safe for consumers to use, but doesn't put the guy out of business before he's even started. So I think pragmatic regulation, and we are not promulgating a light touch. This is full-on regulation. Your corporate governance, you've got to be able to demonstrate to the regulator you know what you're doing. But it doesn't surprise me at all that the smaller territories are moving in a far more practical approach to how this sector should be regulated, because everyone will regulate it, whether it's 3 or 5 years, it's coming.
Yes. I just want to take up now that you mentioned smaller regulations and the benefit of smaller regulations, and contrast that with the United States of America, which is a hodgepodge, has probably 5,000 regulatory agencies, different levels, different products, different layers. But the one aspect that we were discussing on the backstage was the extraterritorial reach of the United States. So you could have a business in New Zealand, you can have a business in Ukraine, but if you service United States consumers, you will be subject to United States jurisdiction in some aspects, right? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, this is a really great point, because, you know, one of the things we talk about, we're talking about on this panel, is there are jurisdictions shaping much more positive jurisdictions for crypto and blockchain companies. But the problem is, as you mentioned, Juan, as I think everybody in the panel has acknowledged, you know, it's a global thing, right? You know, you can't put a crypto company in a national box. It doesn't work that way, by definition. And so we have the situation where we have, say, a token sale conducted by a company out of Gibraltar that's fully compliant with the Gibraltar legal regime, and let's say they make that token available for sale to US buyers. And notice that I said buyers, not investors, because if you're posturing it in the US as you're selling it to investors, well, then there's no question but that you've just conducted a securities sale and that you are subject to US securities law. So if you don't do that and you use the right language and you try and finesse being regulated under some jurisdiction's scheme for securities under their local law, while somehow taking the position that you're not a security under US law, you end up, and this is the real world problem that companies are living with now, we are not just having to comply with the sort of these well thought out jurisdictional frameworks, but with the intersection of those and all of the other regulatory scheme around the globe. The US being probably, I hate to say it, the worst example, because the US regulators take the position, doesn't matter where you're organized, if you're doing business with US customers, you are subject, generally speaking, to US financial services laws. There are lots of good reasons to organize overseas from a US perspective. One of them isn't avoiding US regulation if you want to serve the US. So you have this problem, for example, to make it really practical, you're taking the position that, say, under your local jurisdiction, you're a security. Well, if you're a security, or maybe under their rules, let me give you a better example. Under their rules, you've concluded you're not a security. And you've conducted a public token sale, but you've done it in a way that under US law, it's not clear that you were or weren't. And then you go and try and get listed on US exchanges, and they're under enormous regulatory pressure not to list anything that could be a security, because as cryptocurrency exchanges, they're not regulated securities markets. This is back to your point about compartmentalized regulation and how unhelpful that is. And so it's really a disaster for companies. And, you know, we have, almost 5 minutes left. Maybe we can spend some time talking about practical pointers for people.
Excellent segue.
I mean, clearly we can do better in the future. What do we do now?
3 takeaways for the audience. 3 pieces of advice from each of you, please.
3 pieces of advice? Crikey. First of all, as a government minister, I don't give any advice to anyone about anything. What I would say is, look, the landscape is changing. I've got no doubt the EU, within the next few years, the European Union will come out with standards. My fervent hope is that we will begin to develop international standards over a period of time across this whole spectrum of how these need to be regulated. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but I see different chunky areas, the US, the European Union, Asia certainly, moving in that direction. So if Gibraltar in its own little way can lay one grain in the sand towards that development, great. We don't believe what we've got is the best or is perfect. We are constantly moving along with the times to ensure that we shape the regulatory framework in the way that is best suited to the jurisdiction and to the operators. It's very much a team game. I think you mentioned that before in terms of the need to work together. The private sector is far better sited than we are, so our view is we will continue to work with the private sector, with the regulator, to ensure that we have the best possible regulatory framework for operators.
Yeah, in terms of the takeaways, if you're trying to set up a company now, and just a question, how many of you are shopping for jurisdictions? Okay, there we go. We have a couple people. Good. So, I mean, one of the things that you have to look at is the whole chain. Not only can you get a license, but can you get a license and can you execute with that license? And can you execute in the financial system? Because many people, just because they get a license, they think that they can operate anywhere in the world, and that's not true. So, and we have many, many examples of that. Tesos is probably the best example of people who didn't read the fine print in terms of what a foundation in Switzerland means. So what I'd say is, this is, of everything that you're going to do, this is probably the most important part of your project. Because you can have the greatest technology, the greatest idea, and then when you get to execute it and they say, okay, do we have the bank account? No. Oh, okay. So everything that we did, everything that we spent. So if you're going to spend time, take a look very closely at the jurisdictions and make sure that you can go through getting the license, being able to implement it, and getting into the financial services. So I think that's, for me, is the critical for people who are starting companies.
Yeah. I mean, I would, following on from Jacob's point, I mean, I think wherever you're basing your business, you need to understand and be very, very sensitive about the jurisdictions that you're servicing. As a general rule, most larger groups segregate out the US that they deal with through one regulatory piece, and the rest of the world sometimes they deal with quite separately. I would definitely, we, for 100% of our clients, urge them to take US advice in respect of any US touch point whatsoever. I really think that is a worthwhile investment to make, by the way. Everything else, I mean, I think when people, we haven't really had a chance to talk about it, but sometimes people instinctively think, well, I'm going to move away from a token sale. That's all very old. Now I want to securitize everything that I do, and I want to do everything as a security token. That's now super safe. I would really urge extreme caution when taking that kind of view. Look to really understand not just the law around the selling of the token, but everything around that, including the secondary trading platforms and whether they actually exist, whether that liquidity actually exists, and whether that's a critical part of what you're doing. And then everything else, the advisory services, the arrangement of transactions, the brokerage. There are a lot of regulatory touch points to securities that are beyond just the sales. And I would actually say the same on lots of the other initiatives of the day, stablecoin initiatives and other groups. Really be sensitive to that framework of law and regulation that already exists. So that would be my high-level touch points.
So three quick points. One, I think that with the ICO boom of 2018 having kind of gone very quiet, maybe a good way of saying it. Everybody's waiting for security tokens to be the next big thing. Two quick takeaway points there, 1A and 1B. 1A is distinguish in your minds two different things. One is the same old utility tokens everybody was creating projects around, since the beginning of blockchain and token-based economies, where you have a token that does something in your blockchain, but now you're just selling it as a security to comply with regulation. That's flavor one of security token. But flavor two is where you're taking equity or ownership of something and just selling it in the form of a token. And those are two very different animals, and I think we're going to see them treated very differently over time, where we keep talking about them both as, quote, security tokens. There's a lot to figure out around that, and it's not going to happen quickly. Don't expect a huge boom of security tokens in 2019. That's point one. Point two is I just wanted to emphasize something that one of you already said. When you pick a jurisdiction, it's not about where you're going to, how you're going to escape regulation. You have to like the regulation you're going to be subject to. But two, banking is critical. And you can have the best regulatory structure available to you in the world, and if you can't get bank accounts, it's a problem. So a very important factor in where you decide you're organized isn't just the local regulation, but your ability to get bank accounts. And then the third thing that you got to pay attention to when you're picking a jurisdiction is the tax structure, which is often not an early enough consideration. And then the final thought that I would leave people with is we're in the very, very, very early stages of figuring these things out. You hear us all sort of struggling with the same basic question, which is how do you mash this world-changing technology with a conventional regulatory structure? Nobody knows the answer, and certainly the idealists in the community hope that we eventually, break away from these conventional structures and let the technology do what it's capable of, and it's an open question whether we're going to let it have that chance.
So we're done. We could have gone into many other subjects. One I wanted to discuss and left out was the clash between transparency sought by law enforcement, but privacy sought by civil liberty, civil society, and enterprise. Huge clash coming in the future, I believe. And the second, bit of a curved ball for the Gibraltars. What happens with Gibraltar with Brexit? But we're going to leave it there.
Nothing.
Nothing.
So, but my 2 cents or pieces of advice. The first one is I've always been saying this. I've been a compliance officer for 15 years without being a lawyer, and I left my last company with 28 bank accounts and 30 licenses. That means it is possible to build a compliant service and product. So you have to go build an MVCP, minimum viable and compliant product. If you don't do that, the chances of success for your business are slim. Thank you very much.